Hi, I'm Tim Naftali. I'm director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. It's December 14th, 2010, and I have the honor and privilege to be interviewing Ben Wattenberg here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Wattenberg, thank you for doing this.
Tim, thank you for having me.
Let's start by finding out, how did you come to join LBJ's speechwriting shop?
Well, Richard Scammon and he was America's most prominent cephalogist. Look it up, that's a voting analyst. And he was director of the Census Bureau. And I decided, for a variety of reasons, to write a book that took the census numbers and tried to humanize them. And he was the director of the Census Bureau. He knew sort of some academic polling, and I was just starting in hands-on politics. So I wrote that book, and it came to the attention of the White House. It's a very optimistic book, but not baloney optimistic, based on really hard data. Education, race, income, housing. And one day, I was living in Stamford, Connecticut, and I went sort of freelancing. And I went out for lunch, and I came back, and my 6-year-old son said, "Dad, Mr. House called." I don't know any Mr. House. "Daddy, who is it?" And he said, "I don't know." And then 15 minutes later, a call comes in. "This is the White House, Mr. House." So he said, "Hayes Redmond wants to talk to you." So Hayes gets on the phone and says, "I'm Bill Moyer's executive assistant, and we've read your book. We want you to come down to the White House and talk to Bill and see if you want to be a speechwriter." So like an idiot, I said, "I'd never written a speech before. Doesn't matter." And so I come down 10 days later. And Bill takes me to lunch in the White House mess. Very elegant. You've probably been there. Very elegant kind of place. And we're sitting there eating. And Hubert Humphrey comes up and he says, "Dick Scammon's an old buddy of mine. I read your book. It's so wonderful." Hubert Humphrey, the vice president. And Walt Rostow comes up. He says, "Wow, what a wonderful book." And I can't believe this. And then we finish eating. And Bill, and I sort of give Bill the argument about why America is doing much better than the doomsayers would have you say. So he says, "Come on with me, I want you to meet somebody." And we go through this labyrinthine set of corridors and up a little elevator. He doesn't tell me what's going to, and he says, and we go into LBJ's bedroom. And he had a wonderful schedule, which is he would get up very early and work in his bed with Lady Bird, signing papers and stuff, and then shower and shave, and get all pretty and do all the public events and all the meetings. And then at about 1:30, he would come back in the bedroom and have lunch with somebody, in this case, Henry Ford, and then go to sleep for 2 or 3 hours and take another shower and work another 8-hour shift. He gets 2 full days for one. So Bill says, "Mr. President, this is Ben Wattenberg." And he says, Hank, Henry Ford II. And "Hank, this is Ben. Hey, Hank, how are you?" And then Ford leaves, and we start talking. And LBJ says, points to my book on the shelf. He says, "I've been reading your book." Maybe he was, or maybe he wasn't. "And it's really very interesting, and, blah, blah, blah." And he keeps talking and talking and talking. And he tells me the story of Tommy Corcoran, the the FDR aide. And he said he had a passion for anonymity. Okay. And then later, when I got my oral history done, when I left the White House by, Harry Baker of University of Tennessee, anyway, I said, "What was that all about?" And he said, "I think he was talking to Moyers, not to you." So anyway, we talked for about 45 minutes. I'm lockjaw. I can't believe this. Moyer's picture had already been on the cover of Time, and LBJ was this incredible president. It was really just before Vietnam. And then Bill says, Ben, why don't you tell the president what you were talking about down in the mess? I said, okay. And so I did. I said, Mr. President, the White House is like a gloom factory. Problem, 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 problem. You know, you win votes, especially when you're the incumbent. Let me back up a second. When you're running for office against an incumbent, you view with alarm. When you're the incumbent, you point with pride. That's just sort of the rules of the road. I said, Mr. President, you and President Kennedy before you have this incredible record, and we got data to prove it. Of course, Eisenhower did also, but we didn't mention that. You know, America's a great country. It's done very, very well. So I said, you ought to be more positive. He said, it's a good idea. And then I talked for about 10 minutes, and again, I couldn't believe it. You know, I'm 33 years old, just fell off the turnip truck, and talking to LBJ. You ought to listen. So anyway, then we walk out, and Moyer says to me, when can you start work? And I said, as what? He said, as a speechwriter and an assistant to the president. I said, yesterday, tomorrow. He said, 10 days later, I'm down there, and I have a room the size of a football field right across West Executive Avenue. And he said, go hire yourself a secretary, which I did, and started writing speeches. And then after a while, did not only speeches, but sort of policy guidance, you know, or assistant for policy. And at that time, and I think it was the last White House, I know it was not true under Nixon, where sort of a middle-level aide like myself could send memos directly to the president. And, you know, he'd say, you'd get him back the next morning. You'd bring him in at night, and he'd say, yes, no, see me. I didn't get a lot of see me's, but occasionally. And that's an incredible power to be able to deal with the president and have him answer you within 12 hours. So I worked there for roughly till the end of his term, from August '66 to just the beginning of 1969. And I left because Scammon wanted to write another book, this one about politics, and that was called The Real Majority.
Before we go on to that book, it was very important in our story, I'd like to ask you what you recall of some of the big issues that you wrote about for President Johnson. What were you looking at for him as a policy aide?
Well, it started out domestic. I mean, race, education, housing, the whole gamut of income, mobility. And then, because of the nature of what the White House was going through, I got involved in some foreign policy stuff. First on you know, they had some of the White House speechwriters write what they call rose garden rubbish, which is not, but it's like the welcoming statements for visiting heads of state. So I started writing some of those. And so you'd get over a packet of stuff from the State Department, all full of, am I going on too long?
No, it's wonderful.
Saying, you know, if you're going to speak to the president of Ghana, talk about cocoa prices, talk about farm-to-market roads, talk about a new port. I think, you know, yeah, great, thank you. I mean, that's what the Ghanaians want to hear. What about what the Americans want to hear? So I would take that and use some of their stuff, but started that one and said, Mr. President, this is Johnson speaking to the other president, we are honored to have you here, and we're honored to have you so much because 20 million Americans have their ancestry in Africa. And we've had a lot of problems, but you know, he was a great civil rights president, but we're making headway. And that got the headline, not the coffee prices. Coffee prices may have got the headline in Accra. And then the president of Italy came. And again, they had trade and all kinds of stuff. I included it, but he said, Johnson speaking said, "Mr. President, we're honored to have you, not just because you're president of a great nation, and not because one Italian came here, the Italian navigator, Christopher Columbus, not because one Italian came here, but because 6 million came here and have become great citizens." So that got the headline. And then I started writing. He had one speech at the White House press correspondence thing where the idea is the president tells jokes, some of them aimed at himself, which was very hard for Johnson to do. He was not that kind of guy. And then ends up on an upbeat, let us all be great Americans and face a brilliant future. So Harry McPherson, was the attorney, the counsel for the president, a wonderful guy, a very good writer also, said, "Ben, why don't you take a shot at this?" And he told me what you do. I called it a few. Jokes are good to write in a group. Liz Carpenter came in, and a friend of mine who worked at USIA came in, so we put together sort of a rat-tat-tat of, I don't know, 5-6 minutes of jokes, some of which are aimed at the president, some at the press. Johnson did not like telling jokes on himself, but he did, and he did it wonderfully. And then you take him to the mountaintop. Let's all get together, and it was a huge hit. And the code then, not so much now, is speechwriters shut up about the speech. That you don't say, "I wrote it," but I was smiling like that, and some of my friends in the press corps said, "I bet you wrote that." Me. And then McPherson comes along and says, "Great speech, Ben." So, well, the cat's out of the bag. And then I did a lot of speeches would put 2 or 3 jokes, hopefully with some meaning to them, not just a funny line, at the top of a speech. And it kind of got out of hand. They were honoring Eunice Shriver and that sports, the crippled Olympics, not crippled, handicapped Olympics. He said, "Give me some jokes." And I said, "Mr. President, you don't want to tell jokes in that kind of setting." So he wouldn't talk to me for a week. That was his treatment. And it was a very exciting time. I mean, well, most of the time, much of the time, you felt as if you were at the center of the universe. You'd write things, and they would appear in the quote of the day of the New York Times. And other times, when he went away on a trip and you didn't go, you looked at the janitor in envy, saying, "God, he's got something to do." So, but then, shortly after I got there, it's a long story as to how it came about. He was not doing well in the polls at home. He was trying to re-elect the great 89th Congress, the Great Society Congress. And the polls showed him going down, down, down. So they decided to go on a trip to the Pacific and visit Vietnam, although that was kept quiet. And so Bill Moyers and Harry McPherson went there to advance the trip and cabled back to some of the other speechwriters, do a speech on this for Bangkok and a speech for this in Manila. And these were good guys. I mean, they'd been corporate speechwriters mostly. So they wrote speeches that said, "Mr. President, you should be so proud that you've cut the trichinosis rate in half." And Moyer sent these to me and said, "What do you think?" And so I looked at them, and I don't want to aggrandize myself because some of these were very good writers. I said, "This is crazy. You don't want to start patronizing people. You want to say, you're great people, we're great people. We embarked on what we think is a noble effort." There's been a lot of rethinking on that. I mean, I still think it was probably the correct thing to do, but certainly a very complicated issue. So I wrote Moyers this memo. I didn't hear anything. And then 2 days later, he says, which was 2 days before an 18-day, 7-nation trip, he said, "You're going, get ready." I said, "What do you mean get ready?" He said, "Well, you got to take shots." So I took 7 shots at once. And then my family came down. I thought I would die. Everything was swollen, tetanus, typhoid, whatever it was. But I recovered and went on an incredible trip. We went to, stopped at Alaska, went to Hawaii, American Samoa, New Zealand, Australia, Manila. We flew over Vietnam. A couple of the guys went with him, and he took a real 2-hour stop at Cam Ranh Bay, Korea, and home. 17 days. And I wrote some of the big speeches. And I still thought of myself, I still do it, I was a lucky kid from the Bronx. And I've become very interested in trying to humanize data. And I'm writing at least one book now that tries to do just that.
What was the challenge for you, because President Johnson was not noted for his speaking style?
Well, yes and no. He had this president complex. He followed John Kennedy, who was this Harvard guy with a great speaking style. So when he gave a speech, he would tend to, fellow Americans, this is your president talking, and people would start going to sleep. But you have to remember, in the Senate, he was one of the great orators, and he gave people the Johnson treatment. You ever see that picture of him and Dick Russell, where he's leaning on him like that? So occasionally, when he broke away from the text.
It's all right, we're going to. This will be remembered as a matter of technical. The technical difficulties. There we go. So we'll go ahead again. Back to the Johnson treatment.
Yeah.
And he's a great orator in the Senate.
Well, anyway, so he had this, as I said, he followed Kennedy, who was an elegant man and a wonderful speaker with this wonderful dry wit. Of course, there was a dark side of Kennedy also, which we learned about later. But an inspiring guy. I mean, he inspired me and people all over the world. And here was Johnson, who graduated from San Marcos State University, regarded himself as a rube, and who suddenly, by accident, became president. He had run in 1960, but Kennedy beat him. So he tended, in the beginning, to be very formal. I say, I am your president, blah, 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 blah. And that could put you to sleep. But periodically, he would break away from that and start speaking in his own language, in his own voice. And he was dynamite. He had all the facts of his opinion. He had been doing this for 20 years in the Congress. He was an incredible persuader. He was the great persuader. And but he was very nervous about doing that. It must have been in early '68, before he announced that he wasn't going to run. He had this big podium that he gave press conferences on. We called it Mother, and it had lights and bells and whistles and microphones, and he had a little card to speak from. And you could tell, he said, well, that's a good question, Helen. It seems to me that 18% of the people... And then he, on 2 of the press conferences, he walked away from the podium. He had a little lavalier mic on, and he just started the LBJ stuff. Well, let me tell you about that. And he had all the facts and figures, and he was incredible. And Mary McGrory, who was no big Johnson lover, wrote a column saying, watch out, there's nobody who can beat this guy in 1968. Because when he was himself, he was wonderful. And the idea was to try to write speeches that gave him some room to operate in.
Was it then a surprise when he didn't run, when he announced that he was not going to run in '68?
It was to me. I think about 4 or 5 people knew about it. Westmoreland, George Christian, one of the former speechwriters, Horace Busby, who wrote that last paragraph. I don't know, maybe another person or two. Knew Lady Bird, of course, probably Chuck Robb and the kids. And nobody knew for sure until that part of the speech, which was the end of the speech, whether he was really going to say it. I will not run, nor will I accept the nomination of my party in August in Chicago.
Where were you that night?
What?
Were you watching it on TV that night?
Yeah, and I almost fell off the couch. And then he kept saying, I'm not running, I'm not running, I'm not running. And people kept, then there was a Draft Johnson movement and everything. And he went down to the ranch the week before the convention, that terrible convention in Chicago. And he asked me to come down. And I went down, and one of the policy aides, Larry Levinson, who was Joe Califano, was the deputy, came down. And the word came down to me, write a speech for Chicago. I later learned that a dozen other people were also sending in drafts. But I wrote a speech which I was rather proud of. I mean, it said, it didn't have a single boo line in it. I mean, you could boo if you wanted to boo it, saying, we all love our mothers. But it was a speech that made some points, I thought. And then my understanding was he was going to give it. And then the Secret Service said, Mr. President, we can't guarantee your safety. So he didn't go. And then, as I said, I left the White House a few weeks early and started work on this book with Dick Scammon. It was called The Real Majority. And Nixon has a role in that. It made the case that the Democrats had gone too far left and were going too far left, and they ought to go back to the center. I mean, I guess I mentioned some of this to you, but and it said, look, no matter what you say, the numbers show that the election is not decided by the young, the black, and the poor. The basic voter is unyoung, unpoor, unblack. That's just numbers. That's not racism or ageism. That's just the way it is. And that things like law and order were big. We called it the social issue: law and order, pornography, cursing, drugs, was an extremely important thing in the pattern of voting. And Dick and I wrote it and said it was co-equal with the great economic issues of the FDR time. And later, I wrote alone a book called Values Matter Most, making the case that although obviously economics is very strong, that the way the country is configured now ideologically, those social issues are the most important. People don't want to get mugged when they go out in the street. They don't want their kids to be sucked into drugs, and they don't want pornography shown on television, and you can go on and on and on and on.
How much of this was a reaction to 1968?
Plenty, or the whole 60s. I mean, that's what it was a reaction to, that the Democrats... Look, I went into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in early 1968. I had done a speech for John Bailey, the chairman then. I knew of him from Connecticut. He was the chairman there of the Democratic Party. And I walk in past these little cubicles, and one of them has a picture of Ho Chi Minh up there. I said, what? Democratic National Committee? And the kids were all with long hair and tie-dye shirts. So anyway, the case we made was that social issue was extremely important, and the Democrats play with it at their peril. And they learned in the 68 election and the 70 election that, and to this day, they tend to say, well, they were saying then, law and order is a code word for racism. Well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't. But it's also, or let's say it is, okay? By some people in some cases, it was used to say something bad about blacks. Okay, let's say they were right. I'm not sure they were. But it's also a code word for civilization. My father was mugged twice. My mother was mugged. My son was mugged twice, once in New York, once in Washington. And my sainted sister-in-law was murdered. She was a methadone nurse in Philadelphia, and she was murdered. Maybe that's a little extreme history, although a lot of people were touched by this. There was a crime. Violent crime went up 500% in the 60s.
I'm sorry, this is very sad. And
When was your sister
murdered?
The genesis of what we call the neoconservative persuasion, the crime in America.
When was your sister murdered?
I'm sorry?
When was your sister murdered? When did the murder happen?
Maybe 1971, something like that.
Oh,
70.
I'm sorry. It's horrible.
It's a terrible story. Wonderful young woman. They never solved the crime.
So you think, as opposed to Vietnam, crime was the origins of the neocon movement?
Well, if you track the Gallup polls on most important issues over 2 years or so, which we did in the real majority, Vietnam hit it a few times, economy hit it a few times, but the one that came up most was the various social issues. Law and order, drugs, promiscuity, abortion, which at that time, I happened to be pro-choice, but there was a movement afoot. Gloria Steinem and Bella Abzug led a march in New York with thousands of women saying, I had an abortion, as if it's a great thing. Well, you know, it's a sad thing in my judgment. I mean, okay, I think if a man and a woman decide to do it, they have that right to do it. But you don't go bragging about it. You know, I had an abortion, isn't that wonderful? I mean, there are times it's necessary. I know a woman who had 3 children, was pregnant, and was looking forward to having another child, and her husband was diagnosed with leukemia. It turns out he lived another 50 years, but so they decided to terminate the pregnancy. Okay, that's a legitimate reason. I don't know whether I and my wife would have done it or not, but I think Main Street America was offended by what the left wing was doing.
You talk about a cultural revolution at the time. Was there a sense, remember, we're talking to people who are not old enough to remember this and probably didn't learn about it in school.
The case was made was that there was a cultural revolution. The case was made by the people who believed in it and who wanted it to happen and said this would change America and change the world. Tom Hayden, the Chicago 7 or 6, whatever it was, the anti-Vietnam people. But it was, for the most part, not true in mainstream America. They still, I mean, you know, when Reagan ran, what were the 5 words? Family, country, you know, it's the bedrock, simple, obvious truth. And the Democrats felt very uncomfortable with saying that because they said, oh, that's the stuff that got us into Vietnam.
But there were tensions. I mean, let's unpack this a bit. There were tensions in the how would you describe the Democratic Party? 1968. What is this party in 1968?
I'm sorry?
In 1968, how would you characterize the Democratic Party?
In 1968?
Yes. What is the party?
Split. I mean, you know, you had the very activist wing that was going left and lefter and trying to break all the rules, and you had the sort of mainstream Democrats who said, look, we made some errors, but we're a great party. We've done so much on domestic policy, and you know, LBJ had done fantastic stuff. Civil rights, most notably, against people who, William Fulbright, there's a wonderful biography of him, where the biographer, who is a history professor at the University of Arkansas, flat out states that Bill Fulbright was a racist and believed in segregation. But he was also anti-Vietnam. He had those Fulbright hearings. Well, the anti-Vietnam people, who were very liberal on everything, including race, lionized him. And during one of the Vietnam hearings, he gets up and goes to vote on one of the bedrock bills, the housing bill, to desegregate housing, and votes against it. So there was a huge aspect of hypocrisy there, I thought.
Did you?
And it was this kind of stuff, not foreign policy, that gave birth to the neoconservative movement in America. It was basically the turmoil in America that was taking their sons and daughters and making some of them into yahoos.
Were you talking to Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the late 60s?
I met him when he was, once or twice when he was Assistant Secretary of Labor. But then a couple of years went by, and I was the first chairman of the Coalition for a Democratic Majority, which was sort of a group of mainstream Democrats that were trying to pull the Democrats back to the center. And my hero, Scoop Jackson, and Pat Moynihan and Hubert Humphrey were the big letterhead names. That I think Scoop and Hubert were honorary co-chairman or chairman. And then Pat came into it. And then I'm writing a book now called Pat and Scoop. So the subtitle is How Two American Senators Changed the World. Domestically, sure. But Scoop's foreign policy, a blend of realism and idealism, sounds simple. But the whole history of American foreign policy is either realistic or idealistic. And he said, why can't you do both? It's a pretty obvious idea, but that's not the way people thought. And Moynihan believed that. They later split on the Soviet Union, but much later. And Moynihan had this incredible gift of gab, the Irish gift of Blarney, where he could make things sing that other people, he had this very unusual speaking style, and he wrote his own speeches for the most part, and he wrote and spoke in this sort of anglicized, where Tim Russert used to do, who was his chief of staff for a while, used to do a wonderful send-up of how Moynihan talked. Here was a kid who was in a broken family and shine shoes, and his mother owned a bar, and he enlisted in the Navy at age 17, and was on his way to Japan when they dropped the bombs, and then comes back and goes to City College and Fletcher School of Diplomacy, and ends up being an advisor to 4 presidents, and an ambassador to the UN, and a U.S. senator for 4 terms, or 5 terms, who was one of the most persuasive and listened to senators. And between him and Scoop Jackson, they played a great role in changing American foreign policy. And they argued with Kissinger, and later Ford, Nixon also. They were big for détente. They said, we got to sort of make love to the Russians, everything, which is a legitimate point of view. Scoop and Moynihan and some other people said, no, you don't do that. Those are, when Ronald Reagan said it was an evil empire, the left sort of, laughed, ho, 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 what a barbarian thing to say. But they were evil, and they were an empire. And when he said that, I had Natan Sharansky on my television show, Think Tank, and he said, when he said those 3 words, the evil empire, we used to speak to each other through the toilet bowls, using all up and down the prison. They said, the evil empire, the evil empire, the evil empire. And that was worth, what was the old line that Stalin used, how many divisions did the Pope have? Well, you know, a couple of sentences. I mean, it turns out that Pope John,
John Paul.
What?
John Paul II.
Yeah, Pope John Paul II had more divisions than Stalin. I mean, you know, the Poles listened to him. Eastern Europe listened to him. Every Catholic in the world who tuned into what he was saying about communism and its expansionist and totalitarian nature. And, you know, he traveled all over the world in that Pope-mobile. And so the code of the speechwriter is rhetoric yields reality, or it can. And I was just watching those Churchill movies of World War II. That was the best weapon the Brits had in those days. This fleet was all right. The Nazis outnumbered the Air Force. They were teaching people to be soldiers with broomsticks. They didn't have guns yet. But Churchill gave these incredible speeches. First of all, he called Hitler that Nazi. He purposely mispronounced it, not Nazi, but Nazi. And he said never, I mean, these soaring speeches. I mean, where he'd say, let it be remembered for 1,000 years, we accomplished here, and we will go to the bright sunlit uplands. What a great phrase. I mean, there are no bright sunlit uplands in England. England is, you know, there are uplands, but it's always raining and foggy. But what a great phrase. That's the speechwriter's craft is taking them to the mountaintop.
I want to take you back to a phrase, because you alluded to the center, and it's the center in American politics,
right,
which changes over time. Or
sure.
Can. Would you say that in the late 60s, the Great Society was in the center? The concept of a Great Society.
Great Society is very interesting. If you ask people, did they approve of the Great Society? 2/3 of the people said, no, it's big spending. We don't approve of that. We said, what do you think of Medicare? Medicare is great. What do you think of rebuilding the cities? That's good. What do you think about doing something on the environment? Oh, we got to do that. What do you think of doing new roads and harbors? Well, you got to do that. What do you think about helping our farmers? You got to do that. I mean, Johnson passed 400 laws, some of which minor, but landmark bills in, particularly in civil rights. That's what goes on his tombstone, but on education and the environment. So the component parts of the Great Society were hugely popular. You don't have, today, even the people who denounced Medicare when it was being voted on, no one votes against Medicare. Maybe Ron Paul, but every conservative knows that you vote against Medicare, it's your last term. And look, every human endeavor has flaws, and you want to look for them, you can find it. But I think Medicare, that's why we call ourselves neoconservatives. Some of the conservatives say, no, it's terrible, it's big government. The neoconservatives say, look, if it works and big government can make it work, we're for it.
When did you have a self-consciousness as a neoconservative? When did you self-identify as a neoconservative?
Well, the story on that is I had been the first chairman of this coalition for Democratic Majority, and Midge Decter and I wrote up the billboard ad that ran in the New York Times and the Washington Post and sort of listed the items that law and order, crime, strong foreign policy, anti-communism when it got out of hand, and so that got me kind of thinking, and because Scammon and I had written this book that laid out these precepts of the strong middle. Being patriotic is not something that jelly beans do, but it is for real. Americans are the most patriotic people in the world. We have very good transnational data on that. And then came this word neoconservatism, first as a word of scorn by some guy writing, I forget his name, some guy writing in the Irving Howe, I think, writing in Dissent, and saying these guys like Irving Kristol and Pat Moynihan and Nathan Glazer and Seymour Martin Lipschitz, they're not liberals anymore. They're neoconservatives, and this was a term of opprobrium. And so they, didn't like it. And then Irving Kristol, who was this wonderful, fey guy, said, "Okay, you want to call us neoconservatives? We're neoconservatives." That's a good phrase. It's a good word. And to this very day, if you define neoconservative correctly, in my view, and I am proud to be a neoconservative, that it's for a strong foreign policy, it's for every reasonable liberal program, but not welfare the way it used to be, maybe welfare the way there was a lot of abuse, that we're for civil rights, but not for quotas. I mean, every one of these liberal programs was taken to extremes. Civil rights became quotas to some people. The women's rights were supposed to be for equality, Title 8 or Title 9 for women's sports, which are wonderful, but was taken and twisted to a point that the University of Connecticut, which has a wonderful sports program, they interpreted to say that if women were not as active in as many sports as men, you got to cut back men's programs. Well, a lot of women love sports, and I happen to enjoy watching women's sports these days more than men. I mean, I used to play a lot of basketball. They still shoot up at the basket. The guys shoot down at the basket. You watch them in tennis, and they're serving 100 miles an hour. I could not serve 100 miles an hour, but I love the game, and I could understand what they're doing, and if I was playing against them, I might hit one back. The guys with these new rackets and with these are hitting the ball at 140 miles an hour. Well, I don't get it. I mean, how can you return a ball going 140 miles an hour? So women's sports are wonderful, but when you try to shut it down because the precise number of sports by men and women is not the same, that's crazy.
So let's go back to the Nixon administration's reaction to the real majority.
Nixon was a much more liberal president than people understood.
So
I mean, he was endorsed by Jackie Robinson
in 1960.
Yeah.
Tell us about where you sent, please, the galleys to the real majority.
I'm sorry?
The galleys of the real majority. You sent galleys.
Yeah, bound galleys. And, the little books with you. And I sent them to a number of people in the Congress and in the press, and I sent one to Pat Buchanan, who is I had him on my television show a number of times, and he's a great debater. And of course, we disagreed on everything, but he's a friend. He was later charged with being an anti-Semite. I don't believe it. Anyway, so he took these galleys, and he read them, and he sent Nixon 2 long memos, one of which said, this is what it says, these Democrats are getting wise. These 2 guys are good Democrats, and they're telling Democrats to defend themselves against the charge of being soft on law, et cetera, soft on law and order and weak on national defense. And then the second memo said, here's what we ought to do about it. And, Pat was a street fighter in politics and said we ought to denounce them again and again and again, being soft on crime, non-patriotic in Vietnam, not a charge I would support. And Nixon started giving, Agnew was Nixon's Nixon, they used to call it. Nixon was the hatchet man for Eisenhower, and they called Agnew Nixon's Nixon. And Bill Safire wrote these speeches for Agnew on this campaign stump. Safire was a wonderful, wonderful speechwriter. And again, attacking the Democrats so harshly that at some point it sort of had a rebound effect. But anyway, the book, there are people today, and that was written in 1970, 80, 90, 40 years later. There are congressmen today whose boss, when they came to work in Washington, told them to read The Real Majority, and they tell their young kids to read The Real Majority. The actual specifics no longer hold up. I mean, Vietnam is not in it. But the idea, you got to go to the center. You should be progressive on issues that make sense, but don't take environmentalism to a point where you shut down a dam because of a snail darter, that little tiny fish that nobody heard of. They stop billion-dollar programs because of ridiculous things like that. Governor Cuomo, at a time when New York State was, as it always is, in financial trouble, there was a nuclear plant ready to open, Shoreham on Long Island, and he said, we're not going to open it. $6 billion gone. Why not? Because we didn't have a good escape pattern on Long Island. Well, you know, nuclear power is the safest power known to man. There hasn't been a single death from nuclear power. The worst accident we had was at 3 Mile Island, and the container walls held, and there was less radiation leakage than you get from having an X-ray, a new X-ray, not the old kind of X-ray. Denver, just because it's higher, had 10 times the amount of radiation exposure than they had in Harrisburg in Pennsylvania. So it was everything that made sense: environmentalism, consumerism, civil rights, athletics for women, women's rights, all of which Johnson not only supported, but wrote some of the big laws on and talked them through Congress, was, in our judgment, taken too far. You know,
by 1970, taken too far.
Well,
by
it was, yeah, and it continues to some extent today. It's always an issue in the Democratic Party. It's harming Obama.
Please tell us what you remember of 1970.
President Obama. What
do you remember of 1970, of the election of 1970? You were working with Hubert Humphrey.
I was working as a speechwriter and policy aide for Hubert Humphrey, who I'd met when he was vice president. Excuse me.
How well did your theories work in practice?
I'm sorry?
How well did your political theories work in practice?
Pretty well. I mean, Hubert, pardon me, Hubert was the one thing he was vulnerable to was a charge that he was too liberal. He was being run against for Senate by a guy named Clark McGregor, who had been a 5-term congressman. So we worked together on a speech to the American Bar Association, the National Convention in St. Louis. That was called Liberalism and Law and Order. And it laid out very carefully why you could be both a liberal and for law and order. And it was covered nationally, which is, you know, there are 32 Senate races and 435 House races. It's pretty unusual for anybody running for the Congress to hit the national jackpot. This was covered all over the country. And one of the guys I worked with, Norman Sherman, who had been Hubert's long-term aide, and I used to bunk in with him in Minneapolis. It got wonderful coverage in Minneapolis and throughout Minnesota, except the liberals denounced it. And that was the best thing we had going for us, to say, you know, we're not one of those crazy liberals. And Humphrey scored a good, solid victory. And the real majority, I mean, you know, Hubert Humphrey was a great man, and I was still a young kid. And I'm riding down the elevator one day with him on the way out to some speaking event, and a reporter for the Wall Street Journal is there with us. And Hubert Humphrey, who was being accused of being old-fashioned and everything, is by now sporting wide lapels and dyed his hair prematurely orange and all that stuff, We come down the elevator, and this guy starts interviewing me. He say, "What are you doing? Scammon wrote the room." And I'm dying there, you know. And then he says, it's really funny. I mean, the guy trying to be modern. He said, "What am I, Mortimer Snerd?" You know who Mortimer Snerd was? He was the dummy for Charlie McCarthy, which also dates a guy. Edgar Bergen was the ventriloquist who was the father of Candace Bergen. But he was a wonderful man and a wonderful speaker. We didn't agree on everything, but we did a lot of business later on this coalition for a Democratic majority.
How did you end up working for Scoop Jackson?
Well, after I had written The Real Majority, I became suddenly sort of sought after. And in 1972, maybe late 71, Ed Muskie's, and he was the front runner, Ed Muskie's people came to me and said, "The senator would like to talk to you." And I went up there and I talked to him. He was a very nice man. He treated me very nicely, and he said, "We'd like you to work as a speechwriter for us." I said, "You know, let me think about it," because by that time already, the Muskie campaign was split. They had Real Majority types, and they had liberal types, and it was a constant fight, which ultimately led to Muskie's undoing and to every Democrat, in my judgment, who listened to that kind of stuff. So I said, "I'll think about it." And then a couple of days later, Scoop Jackson's people call me. I said, "Could you meet with the senator?" I said, "Sure." I mean, you know, it's quite an honor. And he was running for president. And he had read The Real Majority, and he said, "Ben, I agree with everything you said. You got it. You and Dick got it." And you could see that he believed it. And he was a wonderful human being. And on the spot, I said, "Sure, you got it." I told my wife later that I had taken this job. And he sort of took a shine to me, and I used to travel a lot with him. And then in 1976, I was not formally on the staff, but had a better job, which is Mr. Wattenberg is known to be friendly with the president or the candidate. And I used to travel some with him and stuff like that. And we remained, and he became very active in this coalition for a Democratic majority and turned his funders over to us until he died in 1983, whatever it was, 82.
Let me ask you about the staff. What was your job on the Scoop Jackson staff in 1972?
I'm sorry.
What was your job on the staff in 72?
I was a head of the communications part, which included speech writing, and also put in my 2 cents on politics. I mean, a speechwriter is a terrific job because, you know, if you get the president or the candidate to give a speech that says we ought to do X, Y, and Z, and he says, goes public and says we ought to do X, Y, and Z, X, Y, and Z is the policy of the president or the candidate. Now, you know, the guys who write policy stuff, they got to write the policy briefs, send it to the president or the nominee, and say, "What do you think of it?" And he sends it out to people. And LBJ, Joe Califano tells this story, that LBJ would sometimes take these speeches that people said, "You ought to do this, you ought to do that," and give them because he believed in them. And then Califano would say, "Mr. President, that's going to cost $25 million. That's going to cost $100 million. So a memo went out and said, any speech that calls for I never saw this, but Joe tells the story, any speech that calls for more than $25 million in spending must be reviewed by Califano's office. But a speechwriter in that sense, you know, if he gives the president a certain kind of rhetoric that says, we understand what's bugging you about law and order, foreign policy, the economy, and gives it the argot to say it in, that's pretty powerful. And what I have always, some speechwriters say, boy, you know, I wrote that speech, that's why it changed. That's really not, you know. What's important is that the president said it, decided that he agrees or disagrees, and then doesn't give it. Johnson had a good way of editing speeches. He would look at it. If he liked it, he'd give it. If he didn't like it, he'd throw it away and get me another speech. It's a good way of
he didn't edit them?
What?
He didn't edit them?
Yeah, sometime when he liked it, but he'd go in and edit it. And his best speaking was when he went on his own. He was a brilliant persuader.
After The Real Majority comes out, do you have any contact with members of the Nixon administration?
Yeah, on and off. Sure. Because many of us in this Coalition for a Democratic Majority were becoming disillusioned with the Democratic Party. I mean, I've always been a Democrat, but some of them, Jean Kirkpatrick she was very close in our group. She became a Republican, and so did a lot of other people. And so we used to hang, and then I became a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, which had more Republicans than Democrats. So I became, I'd been there a few months, and I was standing in a hallway with Nino Scalia, Bob Bork, and Larry Silverman. Scalia is an important Supreme Court justice. Bork was one of the great legal minds of our time and didn't get it. Larry Silverman is now a senior judge on the Seventh Circuit, whatever it is. Well, these were guys who were pretty conservative, but brilliant legal theorists. And the wonderful thing about AEI is you had immediate access to these people. And when Bill Baruti Sr., who was sort of the instrumental guy in reviving AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, hired some Democrats. It's a pretty smart thing to do.
We were just talking about Norman Thomas and the Socialist Party and James Q. Wilson's observation.
Are we rolling
yes,
again?
Yes, we are.
Well, James Q. Wilson, who was a superior intellect of the first magnitude, political scientist, chairman of the political science department at Harvard, and then later now lives out in the West Coast and is at, I think, Pepperdine, made a stunning observation that the great arguments that move American politics had their genesis in the Socialist Party, particularly of the early 20th century. It was Norman Thomas, who never got more than 7-8% of the vote, 9% at its peak, I guess. It was for something like Social Security and something like federal aid to education and highways and roads and all. And then Franklin Roosevelt comes along, and he doesn't say these are socialist ideas, but he says these are good ideas. And they start building the New Deal. And some of the New Deal, no human endeavor is without excess. And so some of them went overboard. Some of them the Supreme Court, rightly or wrongly, ruled unconstitutional. But a lot of them became law. And then LBJ picks it up. Medicare, national health insurance, but not the European style, becomes its genesis was in the mainstream of the Socialist Party USA, not the radical wing, not the pro-communist wing, but today we would call them liberals.
When does the coalition for a Democratic majority start meeting?
When did it start?
Yeah, meeting.
Well, it became quite apparent to many of us in mid-90s. When George McGovern got nominated, anybody who knew anything about politics knew he was going to get a big beating by Nixon. And as it turned out, Nixon won, at that point, maybe still, the biggest electoral majority in American history. He ended up with something like 61% of the vote, almost. And McGovern was being more and more controlled by the activist left. They got him nominated. He barely got nominated. And I later interviewed McGovern on one of my television programs, and he said, "Ben, I was never a McGovernite. McGovernite came to mean really far left guy." So anyway, we saw the Democratic Party going left and left and left. I mean, that image of the picture of Ho Chi Minh in the Watergate headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, to me, tells it all. I mean, Ho Chi Minh is the revered president of communist North Vietnam who was at war with America at that time. So we started meeting secretly because we didn't want it said that, this group of Democrats is what did in McGovern at a proletarian hangout in the Federal City Club, the very nice, in the Sheraton Carlton at night. And we met there, I don't know, 6 or 7 times. And then our little secret held, and we had some pretty heavy hitters in the Congress and among economists and among Democratic activists. So the day after the election, we're all ready, and we put in a full-page ad in the Washington Post and the New York Times, or a 3/4 page, and it's entitled "Come Home, Democrats." And it lays out, Midge Decter and I wrote it, and there's sort of a coda in the beginning, and then a set of specifics. And hundreds of Democrats sent in money. And what it told them, and the people who later allied with us, is they weren't crazy. They too had felt that the Democratic Party was going left and left and left. The media did not make much of a case. You didn't have Fox News at that time. You didn't have a lot of things. A lot of the media said, oh, well, that's what Democrats are. And we said, no, that's not what Democrats are. We're what Democrats are. So, and we were never a membership organization. We had, 1,000 members around the country. But Gene Kirkpatrick said, CDM isn't an organization, it's a state of mind. And what would happen is, because we were on the map politically, when a story was being written about welfare, so they'd interview George Wiley, the head of the National Welfare Rights Organization, and some of the Democratic senators who were in favor of it, but then they had to be balanced. They would interview us. So we would either turn them over to one of our great academics, or I would speak, or the first executive director of the Coalition for Democratic Majority was Penn Kemble, who was a brilliant young man, also a former president of the Young Socialists. Mm-hmm. But, you say socialist in America, and they later changed their name to Social Democrats USA because socialism has that terrible ring to it. But he was hard as nails on a lot of these issues. And so CDM was this small group, got a lot of funding from the labor movement, got some funding from Scoop Jackson's people, some of Hubert Humphrey's people, and we had a staff of 4 people. But in every story about politics, somebody would come and interview one of our people, or me, or Penn Kemble.
Ben, I just want to stop for a minute. Are you okay?
No, sorry.
Why, let's stop rolling.
No, let me get a drink.
Yeah. Are you?
Yes, sir.
Naftali is a Hebrew name.
Yes, one of the tribes.
My mother and father were early people in Palestine. And, my mother's family emigrated there in 1904. And when I go there, I have there about 100 relatives I have there.
Immigrated from where? Where'd they come from?
From Odessa.
Do you remember from that era Richard Pearl?
I'm still friendly with him.
And Paul Wolfowitz?
Yes,
were they both on the Scoop Jackson staff when you were there?
Richard was. I think about Paul, I don't know if he was ever on the staff, but as I understand it, he and Richard both went to Princeton, and they worked on some projects together about nuclear weapons. I'm a little hazy about it, but that Paul was a de facto advisor to the foreign policy team.
When did this group of Democrats become more interested in foreign policy than domestic policy? There's a shift, isn't there, at some point?
Well, I think the word "more" is wrong. It was not a question of saying we're no longer interested in domestic issues, but we're more interested in foreign issues. It started on domestic issues, and then gradually, as we saw what was happening, many of us started saying we ought to be paying attention to defense and foreign policy and controlling the language. I was the vice president of the board of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which had enormous potency behind the Iron Curtain. And we believed, most of us, that the Cold War would ultimately be won as a battle of ideas. You needed a strong defense because the Soviets, wherever you didn't have a strong defense, the Soviets would move in. But the ultimate weapon was ideological, to point out that they were totalitarians.
What was it, SALT?
I'm sorry?
SALT agreement? Was that the tipping point?
Well, it was for some people. It's extremely complicated. But the idea was, were we going to stand tough to the Soviet Union? And they wanted this on SALT, and we wanted that on SALT. And if you gave them an inch, they would take your whole arm. And Richard Pearl tells the wonderful story about Reagan meeting Gorbachev in Reykjavik in Iceland. And they're talking and talking and talking and talking. And Gorbachev keeps saying, we ought to do this, we ought to do that. And Reagan turns to Pearl and he says, they're going after Star Wars, aren't they? I said, yes, Mr. President. And Star Wars is a very interesting program. But
I was thinking, to go back, I just want to get back, if I may, to the issue of SALT, and I wanted to ask you about Jackson Vanik.
Well, Jackson Vanik, this was a bill by Scoop Jackson in the Senate, and his partner in the House, although not nearly as important, was Charles Vanik of Ohio. And it said that there's a phrase in trade negotiations called Most Favored Nation, MFN, which allows a country like the Soviet Union or any country in the world to trade with Americans at a favorable rate of exchange. It's pretty high cotton and complicated, but that's the idea. And if you don't have most favored nations status, it's very hard to trade with America, and if you can't trade with America, you end up at a terrible economic disadvantage, because America had the great technology of the world, this huge agricultural stuff, plenty of oil. Now we still have plenty of oil, but not enough. And so Scoop came up with this idea, working with his staff, is that, and it was aimed at the Soviet Union, unless a country would allow free emigration, it would be denied most favored nation status. He said that, look, if people don't have the right to leave a country, they're living in a prison. It's one of the ultimate human rights. And so they got it passed, and then Nixon, under the guidance of Kissinger, did everything in the world to block it or not to implement it. Their view was that you shouldn't get the bear angry. And Scoop's view, and he was highly respected in the Senate and the House, was if we hang tough with the Soviet Union and don't give in to them, we will end this Cold War much earlier than, he made the point that if you go along with détente, you're accepting that the Soviet Union will control this huge nation of nations, most of which did not want to be affiliated with them, all of Eastern Europe, Cuba. Then they went into Afghanistan, and they were an expansionist empire, as Reagan called them, an evil empire. So that unless you stood up to them, they would keep marching and marching and marching. And so that was the idea of Jackson Vanik, was to insert human rights into the way American foreign policy was conducted. Again, that sounds kind of simple now, but it was not simple.
And this was Jackson's innovation?
Yeah. And he I mean, in its modern incarnation, I don't know enough about the history of foreign policy. And he said, why are we doing business with countries that are prisons? And so ultimately, the Soviets said, we'll never do it. And ultimately, they let out 1 million Jews, most of whom went to Israel, hundreds of thousands of Pentecostalist Christians. And I was asked by I was going to Israel there. I have a large family. And I had heard about this, and I went to the Washington Star and said, I want to write a piece about this. And I said, okay, that's a good idea. And I interviewed scores of newly arrived Russian immigrants into Israel. And they told me first of all, they thought Jackson walked on water. And they told me about anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. And I wrote an article about it. And the last day there, and I was working with the Israeli government and interviewed the people as they came into Ben Gurion Airport at 2 o'clock in the morning. You know, their eyes all blinking, and right off the plane from the Soviet Union. And so this established human rights as Jackson Vanik as part of the warp and woof of American foreign policy. And the Soviets said, we'll never go along with that. Your most favored nation status doesn't mean that much to us. But ultimately, there was this dribbling out of immigrants, which grew and grew and grew. And I had this assignment from the Washington Star, and I wrote a 2,000-word article. And the last day I'm there, it's all ready to be sent. And it's sort of first person. I was here in Israel, and I interviewed these Russian Jews, and the last day before I left, an Israeli diplomat asked me, could you come up and see me? He says, Ben, you know, I know what you're working on. I know why you're working on it. It's a great story. But if you say that you learned all of this in Israel, it might cut off the flow, because it would be, you know, spooking the bear. I thought about it. It's not something a journalist likes to do, you know, to listen to a government when you have a good story. But then I said, look, you know, the lives of hundreds of thousands of people may be at risk. And I said, okay. So I just put a new lead on it, and instead of saying, here I was in Israel, I said, yeah, the plane. So, where was I?
Well, the Israeli government asked you not to.
Yeah, so the Israeli government said, please don't do that. Look, you can do what you want. We're a free country. And I thought about it for 30 minutes. I said, oh, the hell with that journalistic code. I'm not going to put hundreds of thousands of people's lives at risk. So I just took the first paragraph. Instead of saying, here I was in Israel, I said, from listening, I went to London so I could put a London dateline on it. And I said, from listening posts around the world, it is apparent that, and then kept the whole rest of the story. And that, you know, it didn't spook the Soviets, allegedly. But it was an incredible human story. And it ultimately led to 1 million Soviet Jews and a few non-Jews arriving in Israel, a country which had a desperate need for population. And some of those people were brilliant scientists and brilliant mathematicians and wonderful artists. And, you know, the elite of the Soviet Union was world class. And they came to Israel, And most of them, because they had been exposed to the evils of the left when carried to an extreme, became supporters of Likud, Menachem Begin's party, which was sort of regarded as hardline.
To what extent did the real majority become Reagan's majority?
Did the real majority become Ronald Reagan's majority? Well, I mean, I'd love to say sure. That, you know, it won every election since 1970. These were common sense ideas. I mean, you couldn't learn it from the academic books, but you went out to any street corner in America and you said, "What's bugging you?" And it said, "Crime." Okay, so it was a very important book because it stated the obvious, and it was a bestseller. It got widely reviewed. As I said, congressmen of both parties and senators still assign it to their staffs 40 years later. And it was, I mean, I think, you know, like most good books, is simple and obvious, except if you're the first guy who says it. You know, and Scammon and I were a very good team. He really knew election data like no other person before or since. And I, by that time, had a lot of hands-on political experience, and it was mounting. And it was Dick Scammon who suggested to me the idea of starting this coalition for a Democratic majority.
Well, I ask you about the question of the Reagan majority because President Reagan's message was not progressivism at home and you know, crime plus progressive social programs at home and strong defense and national security. So that component of progressive social programs disappeared.
That was right.
The social program part of the real majority that you wrote about, the Great Society programs,
Right.
it disappeared from the Reagan message.
From the Reagan administration?
The Reagan message.
Well, yes and no. You know, Reagan, it's funny. Presidents find it very difficult and very uncomfortable in trying to repeal what has been passed and accepted. Eisenhower did not try to repeal the New Deal. The Democratic presidents did not try to repeal what Eisenhower did. So that's not what how the game is played.
No, but I'm asking you as a former speechwriter because you stress the importance of rhetoric, and Ronald Reagan's appeal to create his majority did not include a promise of continuing social programs.
But he did.
But my point is, what does it say? What is the lesson if you're a political planner, if you're a strategist, and you want to implement the Wattenberg Scammon approach?
Ronald Reagan, to the best of my knowledge, never said a word against Social Security, at least not in a substantive way. He may have said it, you know, as an aside. He did not run being against Social Security. He did not run being against Medicare. He did not run against stopping environmental. He ran against the excesses that those, you know, he came out, he talked about the welfare mothers, how they were ripping off the system and everything else. And people said, "Oh my God, you know, what an ugly thing to say." But it was true. 20 years later, 15 years later, when they ultimately repealed welfare, the abuses were incredible. It then became documented. There was a woman in New Jersey who was getting 86 checks. When they said that you have to show up for your check, the number of welfare recipients in most places went down by about a third because there was something screwy going on. So, I mean, look, Reagan was, first of all, a professional patriot. Now, that may sound icky to some people, but when asked about, can we do this, can we do that, can we do the other thing, and people say, oh no, you can't do that, Mr. President. He'd say, of course we can, we're Americans. And it was that frame of mind that captured the minds of people like Gene Kirkpatrick, the former Coalition for a Democratic Majority mainstay, to go to work for him as ambassador to the United Nations. And the people she brought in as there are five ambassadors under the ambassador at that time had cabinet status. But I think every one of them was sort of a CDM type.
So would you say then that Ronald Reagan was the most successful at implementing the ideas that you and Mr. Scammon wrote about?
I would like to say yes, but that would be stretching a point. I mean, I think, I don't know whether he read it or his people probably read it. But again, they were sort of very basic, simple. I mean, I don't want to denigrate what I was so proud of, but, you know, if you could go out on any street corner and say, what's the matter? I said, the crime thing is terrible. And you put it in a book and said, the crime thing is terrible. And the crime thing was terrible. Then if somebody like Reagan or like anybody else says the crime thing is terrible, it would be nice to be able to claim credit for it, but the credit goes to the man on the street. And good politicians listen to the man on the street or the woman on the street.
To take a slightly different tack, look at a different issue, what effect do you think Watergate had on American politics?
Well, I don't know. I'm not a great Watergate expert. Look, it removed Richard Nixon from the presidency. Luckily, after Spiro Agnew, who turned out to be a crook. I mean, he took green cash money in the office of the vice president. Now, there are crooked politicians, but the idea of the vice president of the United States taking cash in his office is pretty terrible. So it removed Richard Nixon from the scene. It was said that he was trying, at Watergate shows, he was trying to have a fascist coup to take over America. I think that's baloney. It was, I mean, there were some bad things there he tried, a lot of which just sort of occurred. I mean, I don't think Nixon ever said bomb the Brookings Institution. But it was, Jeb Magruder was running it and John Mitchell was running it, and it kind of gets out of hand. And it was terrible and ugly. Was it a threat to the nation's well-being? I don't think so. There are people who think it was. And Nixon paid a price for it. I mean, you know, he did some very bad things. But he was I mean, I say this as a Democrat, he was a pretty good president in a lot of ways. First of all, he was not a conservative. He was a Republican moderate liberal who had to say some conservative things because of the nature of the times and the nature of the party. But his civil rights record was such that Jackie Robinson endorsed him, the great first black baseball player in the major leagues. He took a lot of domestic policy advice from his senior advisor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, which got him into trouble, you know, often. But Pat Moynihan was a brilliant social theorist, and not the kind of guy that a conservative president would put in a high position. So. I mean, I guess I'm in a minority. I think Watergate was overstated. But okay, he committed crimes and he was forced to leave. Okay, so he left.
What effect, though, did the scandal have on the realignment, the changing, and the changes that were going on in American politics at the time? Any?
Well,
in your evaluation?
Minimal, I think. I mean, they said Ford could never get reelected because he was Gerald Ford, he was a Nixon shadow, and he was running 20 points behind Jimmy Carter. He said, see, it's all Watergate, and then he closed it and closed it and closed it and lost it by 2 or 3 points, which is almost a margin of error. And then the next election, there's Ronald Reagan. And, a hands-on conservative, again, who captured the American imagination. What are those 5 simple words? Family, God, neighborhood, apple pie and mother. But it became very unfashionable on the left to say those words, to say, I'm a patriot, I love America. 90% of Americans are willing to say that. And if both candidates are willing to say it, it's not an issue. But if one of the candidates says, well, I don't like saying things like that, well, he's going to go down the tubes.
Is there an anecdote that you would like to put on the record from the Nixon era we haven't touched on today? What did Scoop Jackson think of Richard Nixon? Did you ever talk to him about Richard Nixon?
Yeah, well, I think Johnson understood something about it. He's a very perceptive guy. He was thinking of the election of 1968 between Nixon and Humphrey. And he said, Nixon has it here and here. He's smart and he's, got cojones. And Humphrey's got it here and here. He's very sympathetic and, but maybe he's lacking in cojones. Well, so Nixon...
President Johnson said this to you?
He said it. I had heard, no, he didn't say it to me, but he said it to plenty of other people. And he endorsed Humphrey, but he was very nervous about him because he thought he wouldn't follow through on Vietnam. And he liked Hubert.
Did Senator Jackson ever talk to you about
Nixon?
Richard Nixon?
Yeah, I think most of the Democrats regarded him as Tricky Dick, that he could be devious, and you weren't always sure he was going to live up to his word. But I think he respected him.
Did Pat Moynihan ever talk to you about Richard Nixon?
Not really, but he's written about it to a great extent. And he thought Nixon was a pretty decent fellow, again, who had transgressions that were severe, and he paid the price for them. But
in the
left some important landmarks behind him.
In the late 60s and early 70s, what did you think of the anti-war movement?
I had big problems with it. My feeling then was, look, you could be for Vietnam or you could be against Vietnam, the American involvement in Vietnam. I was for it at the time. Was I right? Was I wrong? I don't know. It turned out history is a tale told by winners, and we lost. Actually, our allies lost in Vietnam. Where were we?
I asked you about the anti-war movement.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. But the anti-war movement did not say, I'm for Vietnam, I'm against Vietnam. They said, some of them, the radical wing said, I want the Vietnamese to win. Jane Fonda went to Hanoi and denounced the American prisoners of war and sat in an anti-aircraft gun. And that was unacceptable to me and to most Americans. You could say, I'm against it, I'm for it. And one of the great problems with the Democratic Party at that not that they were Jane Fonda people or Tom Hayden people, but that they were unwilling publicly to denounce them because they said that's part of our base. And you know, the voters are very smart and the opponents are very smart. If you're unwilling to state, I think the people who are rooting for the North Vietnamese don't understand the situation and you shouldn't vote for them. So again, politics is often rhetoric. A simple sentence or two by a Democratic liberal says it's terrible for people to say they want. I'm against the war. We should pull out in a gradual way, but it's wrong-headed to say you're for the enemy, and unless you're willing to denounce it, you got a problem.
Given your critique of the Democratic Party in that era, did any Democratic leaders, successful Democratic leaders, correct the problem later on, in your estimation, looking back over 40 years?
Did they what?
Did any Democratic leaders, given your critique of the Democratic Party, correct this problem and knit the kind of Democratic Party together that you would have wanted?
Every one of them tried. Every serious Democratic leader tried. Clinton certainly did, and Jackson did. And
did any succeed?
What?
Did any succeed?
Clinton did, and he got very tough at times. And you know, the Democrats. I mean, here's another example. Mike Dukakis, he ran against, you know who he ran against?
He ran against George H.W. Bush.
I'm sorry?
Bush.
Of course.
George H.W. Bush.
He ran against Bush. And I was at the event in Florida. In fact, I was with Mort Kondracki of Roll Call, where they had one of these presidential debates, and Bernard Shaw asked him, he said, Governor, he had this policy of the Willie Horton policy of letting criminals of serious crimes, Willie Horton was a murderer, out on weekend furloughs. It's one thing to say a guy robbed a bank, let him out, but a guy who's murdered and in a life sentence has nothing to lose. So Willie Horton got this furlough, and he went down to Maryland and raped and killed a woman. And so at this debate, Bernard Shaw down in Florida, he asks him, Governor, if Kitty Dukakis was raped by a criminal on furlough, would you be for the death penalty? And he had been against it. That was another great issue. Again, some legitimate, I'm pro-death penalty. So he said, would you be in favor of the death penalty for somebody who raped and killed your wife? So the murderous part was he paused. And sometimes silence speaks, and you could just see the audience gasping, and tens of millions of Americans, what is he pausing about? And then he says, well, it's a complicated issue. You know, I'm against the death penalty, and I'm not. Well, he was dead meat at that point, in my judgment. I mean, if you've got to pause, if somebody said, Tim, if somebody raped and murdered your wife, would you be for the death penalty? He said, well, let me think about that. Again, I guess if you're 100% anti-death penalty with no loopholes, it's legitimate to pause, but most Americans then and now favor the death penalty in really severe cases. And the idea of furloughs for convicted murderers in on life sentences, I think is bizarre. They've got nothing to lose. It's one thing, to have somebody on economic fraud or on robbery or burglary, you can say, well, but for somebody who's killed somebody and has nothing to lose on a life sentence, doesn't make any sense.
Last two questions. One, why didn't Scoop Jackson make it as a presidential candidate, in your estimation?
Well, in 1972, it was his first time out, and very few people on their first time out make it. Carter did, Clinton did, but different kind of stories. And he didn't understand the new Democratic Party rules that were passed, the McGovern Commission of 1968. In 1976, there's a lot of accident in politics. He didn't go into the New Hampshire primary, which was a mistake because that gets all the publicity. He then went into Massachusetts and he won Massachusetts. His slogan, unlike the first one, which was common sense for a change, was jobs, jobs, jobs. So he wins Massachusetts, and Massachusetts is a very liberal state. But George Wallace carried Boston. A little unbelievable, but there was a big busing crisis going on. And he was the guy who's supposed to say he wins Massachusetts. The next big one is New York. And he wins New York. It's a big, big state. But he wins New York by carrying New York City and its suburbs. So the great smart-ass people in the press say that's because of the Jewish vote and Jackson is so strong on Israel, that doesn't count. So here's, I guess, the second biggest state of the union at that point behind California. He wins it, and his staff didn't have the wits to figure that out. He could have campaigned in upstate New York, put a few $100,000 in there and won 2 or 3 districts in that whole, but nobody thought of that. So, and then he goes to Pennsylvania, which is the next big one. And he's running pretty well, neck and neck with Carter. And Carter, there was a holdup in the Federal Elections Commission releasing some monies. So Carter borrows $1 million with his peanut farm as collateral. So Scoop's people go to him. Money is pretty important in politics. So Scoop's people go to him and say, Scoop, put up $500,000 and don't worry about it. We will guarantee that you'll get it back if you lose. So he says, look, guys, you've had difficulty raising money for me when I was a viable candidate. I'm not a kid. He didn't get married till he was 50. He had 2 kids. He said, I'm not a young man. How could I ever pay that back? It wouldn't be fair to my wife and kids. So he's running in Pennsylvania against the guy who has $1 million. And some people said that loan was illegal. It was sort of controversial. So he loses by, 6, 7, 8, 9 points to Carter. If the Elections Committee had ruled that that they would release the funds, and it was a very close call, I don't think he would have lost. And then Florida was sort of the coup de grace, where he ran much better in Florida than he did in '72, much better. But the big race turned out to be between Carter and Wallace. And Carter beats him by a few points. Well, that said, look, here's a guy who can win in the North, he can win in the South. He's our guy. And I didn't think he was a great president. I mean, he's the only one of the presidents that I've known that I don't want to say I didn't have respect for, because I respect the office enormously. But I think he was, there were some parts about him that were just plain silly. I mean, he would get into details where he programmed who played on the tennis courts at the White House.
Let me ask you last question. I want to focus on one issue. You talk about it. You talk about this issue in your writings in the early 70s. It became an important issue in 1972, and you observed that campaign. Tell us a little bit about the issue of busing in 1972 and the effect it had on that election. It will be an important issue in our museum someday.
Look, Nixon was going to beat McGovern anyway. But the busing issue was another one of these issues.
But let's go back to before McGovern was the candidate, when Muskie was the candidate, or looked like he was going to be the candidate. Talk, please.
Well, look, the Civil Rights Act says, in 1964, Johnson's great act says, thou shalt not discriminate on the basis of race. And all schools should be desegregated. And then along comes this busing thing, and you discriminate on the basis of race. You say, you're a black kid, and we're going to send you across town on a 45-minute bus ride in order to desegregate a suburban school or a far-out public school. And vice versa. We're going to take this white kid who's 10 years old or 14 years old and say, you got to go into an inner city school. That's crazy. That's not what any serious civil rights person ever believed in. So it became one of those wedge issues. And again, if you asked a Republican about it, he'd say, I'm against it. Terrible. If you asked half the Democratic Party, they'd say, I'm against it. It's terrible. If you asked the other half of the Democratic Party, what do you think about busing? Half of those would say, I'm for it, and the other half would pause. The pregnant pause is pretty important. Well, it's a very complicated issue. Well, to most Americans, to me, it was not a very complicated issue. It is a very, very bad program to start transporting kids against their will, and that led to the flowering of all these private academies. So then you got, excuse me. So then you got people in all black schools because the whites had left. Well, that didn't advance civil rights. It diminished it.
In 1972, where was Jackson on the busing issue?
Jackson was a great constitutional scholar. He had been a lawyer and a prosecutor, and he understood that it was a terrible issue. This was in Florida, and he thought about it, and he introduced a constitutional amendment because you couldn't defeat it by simple legislation. It could only be done by a constitutional amendment. So he drafted a constitutional amendment. There was 3 items in it. The first was no busing, which got all the attention. The next 2 dealt with huge amounts of funding for public education to help integrate schools, to help improve schools. So, that was the kind of split that there was. What's more important, busing a kid from here to there for 45 minutes to where, black parents as well as white parents did not like it. It was some runaway piece of legislation. And so Scoop introduced a busing amendment and a constitutional amendment, which made a lot of sense. If you read parts 2 and 3, if you read part 1, it sounded like just straight anti-busing, but it was not.
Wasn't he concerned though that he might look like a Wallaceite?
Well, that's what some of the people said, but he had a remarkable civil rights record, and he was terribly offended that people who he had worked in the vineyards with, from Jimmy Wexler, the editor of the New York Post, wrote some terrible things about him. He said, I gave Jimmy Wexler everything. Tom Foley, who later became Speaker of the House, said of Scoop Jackson when he was a congressman, he said he was the closest American politician to being a European social democrat. Later, he was for big government that made sense. He was an ardent environmentalist. He won the John Muir Award. He won the John Muir Award, which was the prize of environmental approval, the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval. So there you have it.
What was the issue of the Soviet issue that split Moynihan and Jackson?
Well, Jackson remained till the end of his life convinced that you had to be very, very strong and tough against the Soviet Union, because if you weren't, they would hang on. And Moynihan had come to the conclusion, I think probably in the late 70s, he went to the Soviet Union, that there were aspects of it that were a paper tiger and that they would fold pretty soon on their own. Well, these are two legitimate points of view. Pat and Scoop were close. Moynihan would say Scoop was his closest friend in the Senate. He was sort of his mentor in many ways. And I guess in retrospect, I thought Scoop was right at the time. I think Moynihan was probably, well, I think they were both right. It's that the Soviets could not be trusted, and you had to remain tough if you wanted to end the Cold War. And Pat's saying they're going to fold on their own weight. We don't have to have quite as much military spending. I don't know who was right, but Pat was no dove.
Mr. Wattenberg, thank you for your time. This has been very interesting.
I enjoyed it very much.